Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable Philip Goff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, it's always nice, Mr. Chairman, to be addressed in such a formal manner. That is what my mother christened me. Mr. Chairman, the Labor Party is supporting this bill as a whole, and in particular it's supporting the third part of the bill relating to Crown entities. And the reason why we're supporting the bill and the section is because the Select Committee was allowed to act in a more independent way, to listen to evidence and to respond to evidence and to correct basic flaws in the legislation. And that meant improved legislation, and to give credit to the Minister, he went along with what the Select Committee recommended, and as a result we have a bill that does achieve support from across the House. And I think that's particularly important in terms of the state sector, because we want to see continuity and we want to see the state sector working as effectively and efficiently as possible and not subject to the whims of changing government and being a political football. Now, there has been flexibility shown by the government in responding to evidence on the ground, but I have some questions to the Minister and the Chair about how this section will work in relation to the performance of Crown entities. And I hope that the flexibility shown on this bill might be shown in regard to the Crown entities and the government's intention to dispose of the Crown entities when all evidence suggests that that will not be in the public interest. Now, under Part 3, the amendments to the Act do a couple of things. In the first instance, they support sectoral leadership by requiring the board of the statutory entity to ensure that the entity collaborates with other public entities where practicable. And I think that's important, because too often what happens in the private sector is that you have a silo mentality and each organisation goes its own way, doesn't think about the wider picture, what's in the interests of the country and what the government wants across the board. And I think that that is a very good principle that is set down in the bill. It also supports functional leadership by expanding the scope for the use of whole-of-government directions. And that really goes down the same track, it follows the same theme, and I think those two aspects in this section of the bill are really important. So what I want to ask the Minister is to perhaps give some practical ideas about how these new powers might operate. And in particular, I want him to address the Crown entities in the energy sector: Meridian, Genesis and Mighty River Power. Now, these are 3 Crown entities. No, I'm sorry, these are now 2.5 Crown entities. So I want to know how this bill deals with the other half that the government has sold off, because the government has established in this bill the principle that it'd be really good to get the Crown entities working together for the good of New Zealand, and now it's sold off half of one of them. And I wonder how this might undermine, that sale might undermine the principle that is set out very clearly in Part 3 of this bill. And I want to ask the Minister how these principles will work in relation to the problems that we find in the areas that relate to these 3 Crown entities. And it's about energy generation and it's about energy prices. Now, the Minister is perhaps aware that since 1997, the prices for power to households have increased at double the rate of inflation. This must be a real worry to the government. Even more a worry because in the last year, I think power prices have gone up at 5 times the rate of inflation to the households. Now, we're debating this bill in the middle of winter, and while those on $250,000 ministerial salaries probably don't even know what they're paying in their power bills, people on this side of the House represent electorates where households are really feeling the pinch. Old people are suffering, we have the problems of hypothermia, we have young people, children who are living in damp, cold conditions, they're being hospitalised, they're missing out on school time, they're missing out on career opportunities. So I want to bring this bill to bear on those particular problems that are worrying so many, Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable.
That are worrying so many New Zealanders. So we've got this problem, Minister, that we have 2.5 Crown entities in this area of producing electricity, and yet the prices have run at double the price of inflation for about 16 years. And they've been doing that since there was another change by government in the way the power companies, the Crown entities operated, which was the Bradford reforms, which was supposedly about competition. But the Minister will be aware that there was a formal report sought and commissioned by the last Labor government called the Wolak report. And the Wolak report found that the 4 power generators made super profits over a 6-year period of $4.3 billion. $4.3 billion. Now, the only upside of that, Mr. Chairman, was that that money went back to the taxpayer because they were Crown-owned. So it was a bit of a cycle. We paid more for our power, but we got the dividends back to the government. Now, that's not going to happen with the sale of the assets. Those super profits are going to go to those wealthy enough to invest in the shares and to the overseas investors. Indeed, as they did with Contact Energy. You know, $200 million a year flowing out of the country to the Aussies, making them rich at the expense of the New Zealand taxpayers who paid for the dam on the Clyde. So this bill is about getting collaboration. And I wonder whether the Minister has considered using the provisions of this bill to set up a single buyer of wholesale electricity. That would seem to be really sensible, Mr. Chairman, if we wanted to tackle the problem that ought to be worrying the government of escalating power prices, consumers paying the gap between what the household consumer and the industrial consumer pays is one of the biggest and the second biggest in the OECD. The cost of electricity is going up at a faster rate than almost any other country, notwithstanding the fact that we produce this electricity through water which is free and assets that we invested in 40 years ago. So I agree with this bill that you actually need to have collaboration. You need to have the Crown entities working together, but I'm asking the Minister whether there is a fundamental contradiction between that very good objective in this bill and what the government is doing in selling off the state assets so that that collaboration will no longer be possible. New Zealanders ought to be worried that the price of electricity has gone up 5 times faster than the overall rate of inflation in the last year. They ought to be worried that the super profits from these companies are now going to private investors and to overseas investors. So here we have a bill that potentially has a solution to the problem of electricity prices, but it's being undermined by another set of policies that the government is pursuing. And I go back to what I said about this select committee. It made sensible changes because we looked at the facts and the government was in this instance prepared to respond to evidence on the ground. And I'm wondering whether the government will likewise respond to evidence on the ground about the failure of its Bradford reforms that will be exacerbated by the privatisation of half of the Crown entities in that regard. Now, there's a second area set out as the objectives of the changes to the Crown Entities Act that occurs in Part 3, and that is to formalise the role of the Monitoring Department and the ability of the Minister of State Services to request information, and also to provide provision for more meaningful performance information to Parliament. Now, those are absolutely appropriate goals, but I wonder how those goals sit alongside the privatisation of the Crown entities that takes them out from the Official Information Act and takes them away from the role of the Ombudsman. We have in the bill good, sound objectives about greater accountability. That's why we're supporting this bill. But at the same time, the government is doing exactly the opposite in privatising these companies so that they are no longer accountable to the New Zealand taxpayer that paid for their construction. We no longer get the information we need. There is no longer the protection of the Ombudsman and the other things that apply to Crown entities. So We have, in essence, Mr Chairman, very sound provisions in Part 3 of this bill. We absolutely applaud the objectives of greater collaboration, greater openness, but those goals are fundamentally undermined in regard to those objectives by what the government is doing against the public opinion in privatisation.
I'm going to call the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Chairman, and I appreciate the wisdom of my colleague, Mr Goff.